The laughter around the long table swirled like champagne bubbles, light and indulgent. Glasses clinked. Strings played. I stood in the hallway between the kitchen and the parlor, holding a tray of lemon scones I hadn't meant to make, but did anyway. Then Amélie leaned in. Lipstick perfect. Hair pinned in the style her planner called effortless luxury. "You're welcome to attend," she whispered, eyes flicking toward the photographers. "But don't sit at the family table. You don't really fit the aesthetic." Chase nodded beside her, not even pretending discomfort. "It's nothing personal, Marin. Just optics." I blinked. Once? Twice? This house, the one where they were clinking glasses and posing beneath my grandmother's crystal chandelier, used to have hardwood so warped you could trip walking from the foyer to the kitchen. I refinished it by hand. They wanted something picturesque for the rehearsal dinner. Charleston charm. Open beams, garden lights, coastal breeze. They wanted history, but not the woman who built it. I set the scones down quietly. Amélie turned back to her friends, laughing as though nothing had been said. I stood there long enough for the warmth of the tray to fade from my hands. Later, I found my seat. Not near the couple. Not near the family. Not even near the floral arch I helped Eliana set up 2 days ago. I sat in the back, beside the rental heaters, next to the servers who offered me a glass of wine out of pity. Eliana passed by on her way to the kitchen. She paused, then sat beside me. She said nothing. For a long moment, just pulled a cloth napkin onto her lap and whispered, "This wasn't right." I smiled thin and practiced. I know I said, but I still lifted my glass when they toasted. I still applauded when Chase made his speech about family and legacy. And I still excused myself before dessert because I already knew who wouldn't be invited to the family photo the next day. The room was silent when I returned, except for the creak of floorboards I knew by heart. The garden lights were still on outside, softening the edges of the porch where guests had toasted everything but me. I walked into my study and opened the bottom drawer of the antique writing desk. It stuck a little like always. Inside, wrapped in linen that smelled faintly of cedar, was the brooch. Gold filigree, a deep sapphire in the center. My mother wore it at her own wedding. She'd whispered to me once, "When you give this, let it be to someone who remembers who they are and where they come from." I'd kept it for Amélie, thought I'd pin it to her bouquet or slip it into her palm the morning she walked down the aisle. Instead, she told me I didn't fit the aesthetic. I set the brooch on the desk gently next to the bundle of old letters, my mother's handwriting looping across yellowed paper. One letter still had a pressed clover inside. Another began, "Don't let the world turn you hard, Marin." My fingers drifted to the worn place on my hand, where my wedding ring used to be. I'd sold it when Amélie got into college and the housing deposit came due. She never asked how I covered it. She only said, "Thanks, Mom," and rushed to pack her things. That was the first time I noticed the space widening between us. I picked up the brooch again, running my thumb over the clasp. It still worked smoothly, like time hadn't touched it. I wrapped it back in the linen slower this time and placed it inside a small velvet pouch. I stared at it for a while before closing the drawer. Maybe some things aren't meant to be passed down by blood. Maybe they're meant to be passed where they'll be honored. The message came the next morning, just as I finished tying the last of the ribboned favors. No need for the brooch. We're going for a more modern look. No thank you, no love you. Just that. A single line that said everything. I didn't reply. I didn't have the words, and if I did, I doubt she'd have heard them over the sound of her curated playlist and wedding planner's checklist. That afternoon, the final walkthrough began. They'd turned my backyard into a magazine spread. Draped linens imported flatware string lights in a crisscross canopy. Someone I didn't recognize with a clipboard and headset gestured toward a folding chair near the catering tent. "We'll have you sit here, Marin. It's just easier for photos. Less visible. Less complicated." I took the seat without arguing. It was warm from the sun, facing away from the arbor. I could smell the trays of hors d'oeuvres before I could see my own daughter. Eliana spotted me first. She walked over with a quiet grace they must have found too off-brand to keep her in the official photos. She sat beside me without asking. Her hands were ink-stained, something she'd always tried to scrub off before big events. Today, she didn't bother. "I brought you something," she said. From her pocket, she pulled a small card handmade, painted violets. Inside it read, "You don't need their permission to matter." For a long time, neither of us said a word. We just listened to the murmur of logistics being finalized, the buzz of people assigning meaning to objects and symbols, without knowing the stories behind them. My daughter would walk under that arbor tomorrow. She would wear designer silk, hold a bouquet, styled by someone she barely knew. And she would do it all without the brooch that once meant everything. But someone else might wear it with pride. And I was starting to think she was sitting right next to me. She showed up at my door with her hair still pinned from rehearsal and her makeup slightly smudged. No words at first, just a breath held too long and eyes full of tears she tried to blink away. "They replaced me," Eliana finally said. "Said I didn't match the look. A cousin from Denver is flying in. Blonde. Taller. She's in half the bridal shots already." I led her into the kitchen, the place that had held every heartbreak and healing in this house. Poured her coffee, sat across from her like I had when she was 12, and lost her first dog 17, and rejected from her first choice college. "You don't have to pretend it's okay," I said. She laughed bitterly. "It's not even my wedding. I shouldn't care this much." I stood and opened the same drawer. The brooch was still in its velvet pouch right where I'd left it. I brought it to the table and set it between us. This was supposed to go to someone who honored where she came from. "That's you." Eliana stared at it. Her lips parted like she was going to speak, but no sound came out. "I can't take that," she whispered finally. "It's not mine." "It is now," I said, "because you didn't ask for it. Because you never once tried to earn it with flattery or performance. You just showed up with kindness and truth and ink on your fingers." She blinked fast, but the tears came anyway. "This means something," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why you're the one holding it." She closed the pouch carefully, hands trembling, and tucked it into her bag like it might disappear if she looked away. "You sure?" she asked. More sure than I've ever been. Outside, the wind shifted. The garden lights flickered. Somewhere across town, someone was rehearsing a toast. But here in my kitchen, something sacred had just been passed, and not a single photographer would ever know it. Eliana looked up, eyes brighter now. "Then I guess I have something to wear tomorrow, after all." The next morning, I called my lawyer. It wasn't a complicated request. Just a small, notarized transfer, the kind no one thinks about until it matters. I watched as the ink dried on the document, formally giving Eliana ownership of the brooch. A signature, a date, and suddenly it was no longer mine, but it had never really belonged to me. It had belonged to the women who came before me, and now to the one who would carry it forward with the reverence it deserved. When I returned home, I sat at my desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Amelie, if you're reading this, it means you've finally asked about the brooch. I was saving it for you for years, but I can't give something sacred to someone who sees history as clutter. You told me I didn't fit the aesthetic. That was your choice. This was mine. Mom." I folded the letter, sealed it, and slid it into a drawer labeled "Only if asked." I doubted it would ever be opened. My phone pinged with a reminder wedding at 4:00. I turned it off. There'd be no seat saved for me today, and for once I wasn't going to shrink myself to fit beside a catering tent. Instead, I placed a small box on their porch and walked away without knocking. Inside was a handwritten recipe, Grandma Delia's coffee cake, the one Amelie used to ask for on her birthdays. Beneath it, a worn photo of the three of us at the beach, before designer themes and guest lists began to divide what once felt whole. There was no note, no explanation. Let them wonder, let them talk. Some things don't need to be announced to make an impact. By the time they opened the box, the ceremony would be halfway through. The vows would be recited, the champagne poured, and the mother of the bride's chair would remain empty on purpose. I drove toward the coast windows, down, letting the wind carry the last of their voices away. Then I found a quiet spot, poured myself a cup of coffee, and waited for the silence to arrive. I was in the garden, pruning the roses Grandma planted, when my phone buzzed on the porch railing. A message from Nina, my neighbor across the street. "Is this your brooch attached?" was a photo from the wedding. Eliana, standing near the arbor bouquet in hand, chin lifted slightly toward the light. Her gown was understated, her hair pinned simply, and right at her collarbone, shining against the silk, was the brooch. Mine. Now hers. I stared at the image for a long time before setting the phone down and continuing with the roses. The second message came 15 minutes later. Another neighbor, then a cousin I hadn't heard from in months. Then the link started spreading. A wedding guest, someone from Chase's side, had posted a photo collage with the caption, "This young woman outshone the bride with something truly timeless." Hundreds of likes. Then thousands. Comments pouring in. "That brooch is stunning. Now that's elegance. She looks like the real bride." I didn't share it. I didn't even comment. But Amelie must have seen it, because an hour later, a message popped up from her. "Did you give that to her?" I didn't respond. Another text followed. "You knew she'd wear it." Still, I stayed quiet. Outside, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the fence line. I poured the rest of the watering can onto the last bush and sat back on the bench, listening to the faint sound of traffic far beyond the garden walls. Eliana hadn't asked my permission to wear it. She hadn't needed to. She knew what it meant. And now so did everyone else. In the photo, her smile wasn't showy or smug. It was soft, solid, the kind that comes from knowing who you are. The kind my daughter used to wear before it became something curated for a lens. I closed the phone, set it down, and leaned back into the wooden slats of the bench. They always said class couldn't be taught. Turns out it can't be staged either. They came back from Italy 2 days earlier than planned. I knew because Chase's luxury SUV rolled into the driveway just before noon, the engine too loud for this quiet street. I was on the porch, cup of coffee in hand, already waiting. Amelie stepped out first, sunglasses still on, but the tension was immediate, tight across her shoulders, sharp in the way she looked at me without looking at me. "That brooch was mine by blood," she said flatly, skipping any greeting. "You had no right to give it away." Chase stood behind her, arms crossed like a hired bodyguard. I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. I just reached behind me, opened the small side drawer of the porch table, and pulled out the envelope I'd sealed 2 weeks earlier. I handed it to her without a word. She hesitated before opening it, her manicured nail catching the edge. Chase stepped closer, peering over her shoulder as she unfolded the single sheet. It wasn't long. Elegance is earned by kindness, not claimed by lineage. Beneath it, stapled with deliberate neatness, was the official receipt of legal transfer. Dated, signed, notarized. She read it once, then again. I watched the pink rise in her face, not the blush of embarrassment, but the bloom of entitlement unraveling. "You made this official?" she asked, her voice sharp. I nodded once. "This was meant for me." "No," I said quietly. "It was meant for someone who remembered where she came from." Chase took the envelope from her, scanned the receipt, then let out a soft whistle. You really did it, he said, almost impressed. I really did, I replied. Amelie's hands shook. You always have to make a statement. No, I said, rising from my chair. I just finally stopped whispering. She stood there for a moment longer, lips pressed thin, unable to argue with a document and a decision already made. Then, without saying goodbye, she turned and walked back to the car. I watched them drive away, the envelope still in Chase's hand, the message delivered, and not a single word left unsaid. The first message came from a former coworker I hadn't spoken to in years. I just saw Eliana's post. Why weren't you at the wedding? Then another. Then 3 more. By mid-morning, my inbox was full of variations of the same question. It was Eliana's post that started it. Just one photo. Her standing beneath a soft arch of white roses, holding the brooch in her hand rather than wearing it this time. Her caption read, "Given by the woman who saw my heart when others saw my flaws." That was all. No names, no accusations. But people understood. The comments rolled in quickly. You looked incredible. She gave you that. That's beautiful in every way. Some mothers know how to raise women, not just brides. And then a comment from the florist of all people. She was the only gracious woman in the room. No one said Amelie's name. They didn't have to. The silence around her was louder than a scream. By the end of the day, even the caterer had shared the post, captioning it with, "Some things you can't plate. Grace is one of them." I sat at the kitchen table reading each line with a quiet ache. I hadn't intended for this to become public. I had no desire to shame Amelie or Chase. But now the story was out there, not because I told it, but because truth has a way of finding daylight. And while the world seemed to rally around a single gesture, a single brooch, what they didn't see was the empty space it left in me. I had imagined giving it to Amelie since she was 13. I had saved it through lean years, through late rent and lost jewelry boxes. And now it was gone, given not taken. Rightfully so. Still that night, as I folded laundry and closed the blinds, I felt the weight of something invisible. Not regret. Just the gravity of a choice finally honored. And with the world watching, perhaps finally understanding, I poured one last cup of coffee and turned off the lights. Eliana came by just before her flight. The cab waited at the curb trunk, open, her suitcases already packed. But she still knocked on my door like a girl asking permission. I opened it and smiled. She looked different now. Taller, somehow. Maybe it was the certainty in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you," she said, stepping inside. "For everything." I poured 2 cups of coffee and motioned to the kitchen table, the same table where she'd cried weeks ago, cheeks blotched with humiliation. "You didn't just give me jewelry," she continued. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" I asked, though. I already knew. Faith. In myself. In women like us. She reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a photo Eliana on campus, standing in front of the historic preservation building in Boston. Her caption read, "Every structure worth saving has a story. So do we." I stood and walked to my bedroom. From the top shelf of my closet, I took down a wooden box, the kind lined with velvet that smells faintly of old cedar and memories. Inside was a necklace, thin gold set with a small opal, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. "My grandmother gave this to me before I left home," I said. "It's not much, but it's lasted." Eliana's eyes widened. "Marin, I can't." "You can," I said. "And you will. Take it. Blood isn't always the right vessel. But you've carried this family's values better than those born into it." Her hands shook as she took the box. She didn't cry this time. Just nodded, lips pressed together, like she didn't trust herself to speak. At the door, she hugged me tight. You're part of every good thing I build from here on. I stood on the porch as her cab pulled away the necklace now, with her the brooch already gone. And as the wind stirred the roses near the walkway, I turned back inside and reached for the last envelope I hadn't yet mailed. The message came just after sunrise. From Amélie, "You gave away what was mine." No greeting, no name. Just that sentence laced with entitlement and a bitterness that no wedding gift could have sweetened. I stared at it for a while. Not angry, not sad. Just tired, in that deep, marrow-heavy way you feel after carrying something too long that was never meant for you. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the closet and took down the small box I'd marked years ago in thick black ink. What I survived. Inside were pieces of a life no one ever asked about. The hospital bracelet from when I gave birth to her alone. The eviction notice I beat by selling my wedding ring. A crumpled program from her elementary school play where I sat in the back row because the front was reserved. I folded Amélie's printed letter, the one she left inside the envelope I'd given her, and added it to the box. Her handwriting still looked like it did when she was 12, when she used to write me notes that ended with hearts. Then I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal. The steam curled above the mug like breath from something finally exhaled. The heirloom didn't leave the family, I wrote. It found where it was safest. Not in bloodlines, not in appearances, but in character, in respect. I closed the journal and looked out the window. The roses were blooming again. Not all of them bloomed the same way. Some were wild, unpredictable, others precise, measured. All of them grew. The doorbell rang a few minutes later. I didn't move. Some things don't deserve an answer. I let the moment pass, let the knocking fade, and turned the page.